Stop whatever you're doing right now. I mean that. Put the phone down, pull up a chair, because what I'm about to walk you through is not political commentary and it is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, verifiable, ongoing economic crisis that most Americans have no framework to understand, and it is already inside your house. There is a stretch of water on the other side of the planet that most of you couldn't find on a map in under 30 seconds. It is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. You could drive that distance in under 20 minutes on a highway. People have literally swum wider channels for sport. And right now, that 33-kilometer sliver of ocean is strangling the American economy from the inside out. Gas prices, grocery bills, airline tickets, diesel surcharges on every package you order online, mortgage rates that climbed 30 basis points in 2 weeks. None of that happened randomly. Every single one of those numbers traces a direct line back to one place, the Strait of Hormuz. And once I walk you through exactly how that connection works, step by step, mechanism by mechanism, dollar by dollar, you will never look at your gas pump the same way again. So let's get into it. Here's what most Americans currently understand about the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Oil prices are going up because there's a war in the Middle East. Full stop. That's the entire mental model most people are working with. And that model is so incomplete that it's actually making things harder to navigate. Because if all you see is war equals high gas prices, you have no way of predicting what comes next. No way of understanding why this one is different from every previous Middle East conflict, and no way of taking sensible steps to protect your household from what's coming. The mainstream media's failure here is not about partisanship. It's about depth. They show you tankers on fire and oil futures charts climbing, and they move on to the next segment in 4 minutes. What they never explain is the architecture underneath it all. The plumbing of the global economy that runs directly through that strait and connects an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf to the price of a box of pasta in a grocery store in Ohio. That connection is real, it is specific, and it is already operating. Here's what's actually happening. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a trade route. It is the single most consequential choke point in the entire global economy. Right now, on March 18th, 2026, 18 days into Operation Epic Fury, it sits functionally closed. Tanker traffic has dropped to near zero. The IRGC is publicly on record threatening oil at $200 per barrel. Brent crude is trading above $130. And the economic pressure valve that Iran just tightened is connected to every household in America through a chain of mechanisms that most people have never had explained to them clearly until now. Before we walk through the mechanics of how this waterway operates, let those numbers land properly, because this is not an abstraction. This is your money. 3 weeks ago, the national average for a gallon of regular gasoline sat at $2.92. As of this week, that number has climbed to $3.72, an 80-cent increase in 18 days. A single Shell station in San Francisco was photographed on March 12th with regular fuel posted at $6.50 per gallon. Diesel is heading toward $5, and trucking companies including FedEx have already started adding fuel surcharges to every package and shipment moving across the country. The average American household burns roughly 90 gallons of gasoline per month. Work through that math. 80 cents per gallon times 90 gallons is $72 extra every single month that did not exist in your budget 18 days ago. That's $864 over the course of a year. And the underlying pressure that drove those numbers has not resolved. The strait is still closed. No ceasefire is on the table. Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, has quantified what this kind of sustained increase actually costs at scale. Every single cent per gallon that gasoline prices rise and stay elevated increases national gasoline spending by $1.4 billion over the course of a year. Not the total spike. 1 cent, 1 year, $1.4 billion. Let those numbers land properly. Groceries are next. Urea fertilizer, the primary nitrogen fertilizer American farmers depend on for spring planting, climbed from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton between February 28th and mid-March, a 35% jump in under 3 weeks. And the American Farm Bureau president wrote directly to President Trump on March 9th to warn that farmers heading into the spring planting season are facing rapidly escalating fuel and fertilizer costs that they cannot absorb without passing them on. RSM US, the economic analysis firm, estimates that American consumers will begin seeing food price increases in stores within 60 days, not eventually. Within 60 days, Goldman Sachs revised their U.S. inflation forecast upward to between 2.9 and 3.3% and raised recession odds to 25%, 1 in 4, since the conflict began. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario where global oil averages $140 per barrel for just 2 consecutive months, And their conclusion was a full economic standstill in the United States, not a slowdown, a standstill. And mortgage rates moved from 5.99% on February 27th to 6.29% by March 12th, a 30 basis point jump in 2 weeks, driven by the oil inflation bond yield chain I'm going to explain to you shortly. On a $300,000 mortgage, 30 basis points is not a rounding error. It is roughly $60 per month, every month for 30 years. This is what the Strait of Hormuz looks like inside your house. Now let me show you exactly how it got there. Pull up a map, find the Persian Gulf. Now look at the narrow exit point where the Gulf drains into the Arabian Sea. That exit is the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest, it measures 33 kilometers across. On the northern shore sits Iran. On the southern shore sit the United Arab Emirates and Oman, two GCC member states that are U.S. allies. The shipping lanes through the strait run in two directions in channels that are each roughly 3 kilometers wide. Now let those dimensions sit for a moment. 3 kilometers of navigable channel, 2 directions. That is the width of the shipping lane that carries 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply. 20 million barrels of petroleum liquids every single day moving through a corridor that most Americans have never thought about for 5 minutes in their lives. This is not one of several important shipping routes. This is, by any serious measure, the most critical energy choke point on Earth. The Suez Canal carries roughly 12% of global trade. The Panama Canal moves around 5% of global trade. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of the world's oil and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, both through the same 33-kilometer passage. There is no comparable alternative, none. Rerouting oil tankers around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa adds 15 to 20 days to every transit. It costs more. It produces less. And most ships currently in service aren't equipped or contracted for it. The countries that depend on this strait most directly are not abstract geopolitical actors. They are America's largest trading partners and competitors. China draws 40% of its entire oil supply from this corridor. India draws 60%. Japan draws 75%. Japan's prime minister made the stakes clear in explicit terms. A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would drain Japan of its operational oil reserve within 8 to 10 months and produce an economic collapse, not disruption, collapse. Iran sits on the northern shore of this strait with its military assets deployed in the Zagros Mountains directly overlooking the passage. The IRGC has anti-ship missile batteries capable of targeting anything moving through those channels. It has mine-laying capabilities that can render the shipping lanes impassable. It has patrol boat swarms and drone capacity that can complicate any vessel transit. Former White House energy advisor Bob McNally described the strategic reality plainly. All Iran has to do is demonstrate every day or every other day that it has the means and the ability to attack ships, and that demonstration alone is enough to stop the traffic. The threat does the work before a single weapon fires. This is the architecture. Now let me show you the 5 mechanisms through which it reaches your household. Here's what most people miss about oil prices and why the president's argument that America has its own oil doesn't hold up under examination. Oil is not a domestic commodity priced on domestic supply and demand. It is a globally fungible commodity traded in a single global market, and its price is set by that global market regardless of where any individual barrel was produced. When a Saudi tanker gets blocked in the Strait of Hormuz and that barrel never reaches a Japanese refinery, Japanese refiners buy American crude instead. That additional demand from Japan pushes up the price of American crude. When Iranian mines in the strait raise maritime insurance rates for all vessels globally, those cost increases land on every buyer in every market. Texas oil does not have a discount window for Americans. It prices at whatever the global market will bear. Bob McNally, who advised the White House on energy policy, stated the mechanism with unusual directness. There are no policy solutions to a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, not a strategic petroleum reserve release, not emergency OPEC production increases, not domestic drilling acceleration. None of those tools address the fundamental arithmetic of removing 20 million barrels per day from global circulation. The International Energy Agency did release a record 400 million barrels from global strategic reserves. That number sounds enormous. It is not. Global daily oil consumption runs at approximately 105 million barrels per day, which means 400 million barrels covers roughly 4 days of normal global demand. Not 4 weeks, not 4 months, 4 days. Brent crude still ended recent trading above $130 per barrel despite that record release. The insurance mathematics compound the problem independently of the physical oil supply. Maritime war risk insurance policies contain a 72-hour cancellation clause that allows underwriters to recalibrate their exposure the moment conditions in a region change. When Iranian pressure on the strait activated in the first days of the current conflict, war risk insurance premiums jumped to 4 to 5 times their pre-conflict levels within 72 hours. Ship operators running those numbers decided many transits were no longer economically viable. According to the tracking firm Kepler, tanker traffic through the strait dropped by approximately 70% in the opening days before falling to near zero. It was not a single act of force force that stopped those ships. It was the calculation that the insurance cost alone made the trip financially irrational. At the height of the pressure, approximately 700 ships sat stranded in the region, including around 400 oil tankers, collectively holding an estimated 200 million barrels of crude. That is oil that was produced, loaded, and is sitting in vessels that cannot complete their delivery. The market priced that reality immediately and without sentiment. The transmission from global oil price to your gas pump is not instant. It runs through a refinery lag of roughly 3 to 6 weeks, which means the full price impact of the current closure has not yet arrived at American gas stations. What you're seeing at the pump today reflects oil price decisions made in the first week of the conflict. The decisions made this week will arrive at your pump in April. This is the mechanism most media coverage misses entirely, and it is the one that will affect more American families more severely over the next 60 to 90 days than the gas price increase will. Roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a peripheral fact. It is the entire supply chain backstory for American food production. Nitrogen fertilizer is not optional for industrial-scale American agriculture. Modern corn, wheat, and soybean yields at their current scale are only possible because farmers apply nitrogen fertilizer at planting. The primary nitrogen fertilizer is urea, and a substantial portion of global urea production comes from plants in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Iran that depend on natural gas feedstock, much of which also transits the Gulf region. That urea then moves through the Strait of Hormuz to reach the international market. When the strait closes or becomes too risky to transit, urea supply contracts and urea prices jump. Between February 28th and mid-March, urea prices at the New Orleans fertilizer hub, the primary pricing benchmark for American agricultural inputs, moved from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton, a 35% increase in under 3 weeks. American farmers buying fertilizer for spring planting are buying it right now this week at those elevated prices. Fertilizer costs are typically one of the two largest expenses in a corn or wheat farmer's annual operating budget. A 35% increase does not get absorbed silently by the farm. It flows through the supply chain. Grain prices increase at the elevator. Food manufacturers pay more for the grain. Grocery stores pay more for the packaged food, and consumers pay more at the register, with a 60 to 90 day delay from the input cost spike to the retail price change. RSM US has estimated that delay explicitly. The 60-day clock started on February 28th. It is running. Wayne Weingarten, an economist at the Pacific Research Institute, summarized the cascade. The war is putting upward pressure on prices for gasoline, electricity, and groceries through higher transportation, packaging, and fertilizer costs. It will worsen affordability for families already struggling with high costs of living. Now add the diesel dimension on top of the fertilizer story. Food gets to American grocery stores on diesel-powered trucks. The trucks that carry fresh produce from California farms to Chicago distribution centers run on diesel. The ships that carry imported foods to East Coast ports run on diesel-equivalent bunker fuel. Diesel pricing at $5 per gallon or above does not stay at the truck stop. It moves directly into freight costs, which move directly into the price of every product those trucks carry. Fresh food feels this first. It has the thinnest margins and the fastest price transmission in the supply chain. Packaged goods follow a few weeks later, but they all follow. Jet fuel and diesel are refined from the same crude oil that makes gasoline. When crude prices spike, they spike together. Since February 28th, jet fuel costs have risen 25%. That number is not visible to airline passengers yet. It shows up on the income statements of Delta, United, American, and Southwest first, and then it migrates into ticket prices on a 4 to 8 week lag as airlines reprice their forward booking inventory. Airlines entered the current crisis with tighter cash reserves than pre-pandemic levels. They cannot absorb sustained 25% jet fuel increases without passing them through. Business travel, leisure travel, and the cost of every flight you book in April and May will reflect the current jet fuel cost environment. The shipping cost transmission is already visible at the invoice level for businesses. FedEx added fuel surcharges following the initial price spike. UPS followed. The major freight carriers are not absorbing these costs. They are contractually permitted to pass them through, and they are. For consumers, this shows up as increased shipping fees on e-commerce purchases, which then either gets added to the displayed checkout cost or gets built into the base product price by sellers who can no longer offer free shipping economically. Either way, it lands on the consumer. The broader supply chain impact is layered. Manufacturing companies that import components from Asia are paying higher freight costs on every container. Retailers who import goods from Southeast Asian factories are paying more to move those goods. The entire import-dependent segment of American retail, clothing, electronic, furniture, home goods, is absorbing these cost increases right now and deciding week by week how much of them to pass through and how quickly. This is the one that surprises most people because most people don't connect oil prices to their mortgage. But the connection is direct, documented, and already moving. Here is the chain. Oil prices rise. Energy costs across the economy rise. Not just gasoline, but manufacturing manufacturing input, freight costs, heating costs, power generation costs. Those energy cost increases feed into the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation. The Federal Reserve watches CPI. When CPI rises faster than the Fed's 2% target, the Fed has a harder case for cutting interest rates. The Fed's rate decisions are tracked by the bond market, which prices 10-year Treasury yields accordingly, and 30-year mortgage rates track 10-year Treasury yields almost exactly. Goldman Sachs revised their U.S. inflation forecast upward to between 2.9 and 3.3% following the Hormuz closure. That revision explicitly forecasts that inflation will remain above the Fed's target for longer than previously projected, reducing the probability of near-term Fed rate cut. Rachel Zamba, a risk analyst who has tracked this transmission mechanism, described the outcome directly. Inflation remaining stickier makes it harder for the Fed to cut interest rates, and mortgage rates might be stuck at their current levels or pushed higher. The numbers tell the story in real time. February 27th, one day before Operation Epic Fury began, the average 30-year mortgage rate sat at 5.99%. By March 12th, it had moved to 6.29%, 30 basis points in 2 weeks. On a $300,000 loan, that is approximately $60 per month in additional interest, $720 per year for the entire life of the loan. On a $500,000 loan, it is $200 per year, every year, for 30 years. For anyone currently carrying a variable rate mortgage or a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, the increase is not theoretical and it is not lag. Variable rates adjust automatically, and they are adjusting now. Anyone who has been waiting for rates to fall before buying a home is sitting on an assumption that rested on a Fed pivot that Goldman's revised inflation forecast has made considerably less certain than it appeared in January. The stock market transmission compounds the picture. The Dow crossed 50,000 for the first time in history on February 6, 2026. By March 17th, it had retreated to approximately 46,560. The S&P 500 has shed 2.5% since the conflict began. Goldman's 25% recession probability is not a fringe forecast. It is the base case from one of the most closely watched economic research teams in the world. A 25% probability of recession is not certainty. It is also not a number you ignore. This mechanism operates on a longer timeline than the others, but it carries the largest potential long-term consequence for American financial markets, and it connects the Strait of Hormuz directly to the value of American technology stocks in a way that almost no mainstream coverage has explained. To understand it, you need to understand the petrodollar system in one sentence. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, sell oil for US dollars, and they recycle those dollars into American financial markets. That recycling has been one of the dominant sources of capital flowing into American equities and bonds for decades. The sovereign wealth funds of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait have invested enormous sums in American technology companies. Names you know: Nvidia, Microsoft, Google, Apple. The GCC sovereign wealth funds are meaningful holders of the companies that became the most valuable corporations in history. That capital flowed in because Gulf oil revenue was strong, stable, and denominated in dollars. Now consider what happens to Gulf oil revenue when the Strait of Hormuz closes. Saudi Aramco cannot export its oil. The UAE cannot export its oil. Qatar cannot export its LNG. The oil that would have generated the dollars that would have been recycled into American equities stays in the ground or sits on tankers that cannot transit. Gulf sovereign wealth revenues contract. When those funds experience revenue contraction, they do not immediately liquidate American positions. These are long-term strategic investors, not day traders, but they do reduce the pace of new investment. They reassess exposure. They rebalance. And at the margin, that reduction in demand for American assets shows up as pressure on American equity valuations. Goldman Sachs has specifically flagged this Gulf sovereign wealth channel as one of several headwinds facing American tech stocks in the current environment. For anyone within 10 to 15 years of retirement, the compounding of these 5 transmission mechanisms, gas prices, food prices, freight costs, mortgage rates, and equity market pressure, is not a set of separate problems. It is one integrated problem with one geographic origin point, a 33-kilometer stretch of water that is currently functioning as Iran's most powerful economic weapon. Being credible here requires being honest about the limits of what any policy response can accomplish. The mainstream media version of this crisis consistently oversimplifies what the available tools actually do. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release matters at the margin. Releasing 400 million barrels, the largest such release in history, covers approximately 4 days of global oil consumption. It bought time. It did not change the underlying supply equation. The moment the release stops and strategic reserves are finite, the market prices the remaining supply reality. Diplomatic engagement matters, but diplomatic engagement requires a counterparty willing to negotiate, and the IRGC has stated publicly that the strait will remain closed as long as U.S. and Israeli military operations continue on Iranian territory. The strait and the war are linked. You do not get one resolved without resolving the other. Domestic production increases take time. The fastest any new American production can come online in meaningful volume is 6 to 18 months from the investment decision. That timeline does not help with a crisis measured in weeks. None of this means the situation is without resolution. Wars end, straits reopen. But the honest assessment of the near-term window, the next 60 to 90 days, is that the 5 mechanisms I've described are operating and will continue operating until the underlying conflict changes. Iran carries real vulnerabilities too. Severe domestic water scarcity, 45 years of sanctions damage to its industrial base, ethnic tensions that create internal pressure. The counter-strategy pursued by the United States and Israel targets exactly those vulnerabilities. This is a contest of long-term pressure in both directions, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Gregory Dacko, chief economist at EY Parthenon, described the risk horizon directly. The longer this lasts, the more significant the shock will be. The current trajectory points toward deepening rather than resolving pressure over the next quarter. Step back now and look at all 5 mechanisms as a single machine, because that is what they are. The oil price transmission hits your gas pump immediately. The food chain transmission hits your grocery bill on a 60-day lag. The airline and shipping cost transmission hits your e-commerce checkout and travel costs on a 4 to 8 week lag. The inflation and mortgage rate transmission compounds all of those into higher financing costs and suppressed Fed policy flexibility. And the Gulf financial flow disruption creates long-run headwinds for the equity valuations that underpin most American retirement accounts. None of these mechanisms operates independently. They reinforce each other. Higher oil prices increase inflation. Higher inflation delays Fed cuts. Delayed Fed cuts maintain pressure on mortgage rates. Higher mortgage rates suppress housing activity. Suppressed housing activity reduces consumer spending. Reduced consumer spending raises recession probability, and elevated recession probability feeds back into equity market volatility, which erodes retirement account value. The 33-kilometer strait is not just a gas price story. It is a compression of 5 separate pressure channels operating simultaneously on the household finances of ordinary American families. And the families that understand that compression, who see the system rather than just the headlines, are the ones positioned to make sensible decisions about what comes next. Given everything I've walked you through, here is where your attention should be focused right now. On fuel costs, gas moved from $2.92 to $3.72 in 18 days, and the underlying pressure has not resolved. A gas rewards credit card returning 5% on fuel purchases is a real monthly number at $4 per gallon. A price tracking app like GasBuddy that identifies the cheapest stations in your area turns every fill up into an actual decision rather than a default. Reducing unnecessary driving and combining errands costs nothing but 5 minutes of planning. Anyone weighing a vehicle purchase should factor in that economists are describing this oil shock as lasting months, not days. On food costs, stock shelf stable essentials now, canned goods, dry beans, rice, pasta, frozen proteins at today's prices before the 60-day food price spike arrives. This is not panic buying. It is buying ahead of an increase that is already priced into the supply chain. On investments, energy stocks are benefiting. Airlines, shipping companies, consumer retail, and certain tech names with Gulf sovereign wealth exposure are under pressure. Anyone within 5 to 10 years of retirement has a concrete reason to review their allocation with an advisor in the context of Goldman's revised inflation forecast. On your mortgage, variable rate holders and HELOC holders should check their current rate this week. The 30 basis point move that already happened is documented and real. The forces driving it further have not gone away. On cash reserves, 3 to 6 months of essential expenses in a high-yield savings account paying 4 to 5% annually is the single most powerful financial buffer in any of the scenarios the current economic environment produces. The families that come through this period without lasting financial damage will not be the wealthiest families. They will be the families that built a cushion before the shock deepened. Let's run through this one final time cleanly and clearly. The Strait of Hormuz is a 33-kilometer waterway that carries 20% of global oil and 20% of global LNG every day. Iran sits on its northern shore with the military capability to close or threaten it at will. Right now, on March 18th, 2026, it is functionally closed, and 5 distinct economic mechanisms are transmitting that closure directly into your household. Mechanism 1, direct oil price transmission. The global oil market is one market. When supply tightens anywhere, prices rise everywhere. Brent crude is above $130 per barrel. Gas has already jumped 80 cents in 18 days. Mechanism 2, the food chain transmission. Fertilizer prices are up 35%. Diesel is approaching $5 per gallon. RSM US estimates food price increases arrive at American grocery stores within 60 days. That clock started February 28th. Mechanism 3, airline and shipping cost transmission. Jet fuel is up 25%. Freight surcharges are already live. Ticket prices and e-commerce shipping costs will follow on a 4 to 8 week lag. Mechanism 4, inflation and mortgage rate transmission. Goldman Sachs has raised its inflation forecast to 3.3% and raised recession odds to 25%. Mortgage rates have moved 30 basis basis points in 2 weeks. The Fed pivot that many buyers were counting on is now materially less certain. Mechanism 5, Gulf financial flow disruption. GCC sovereign wealth funds are a meaningful source of capital for American tech equities. Disrupted Gulf oil revenues mean disrupted investment flows, a long-run headwind for the equity valuations that underpin American retirement account. 5 mechanisms, 1 choke point, 18 days in, and already hitting every major category of household finance simultaneously. Share this with someone you care about, because right now there are millions of American families watching prices climb at the pump and at the register with no framework to understand why, no way to anticipate what comes next, and no tools to protect themselves from what's coming. Understanding what's actually happening, tracing the chain from a 33-kilometer waterway to your grocery bill is not a luxury. It is the starting point for every sensible financial decision you can make in the next 60 days. The window to get ahead of the food price increase is still open. The window to review your mortgage exposure is still open. The window to build a cash cushion before the shock deepens is still open. None of those windows stay open indefinitely. Drop your questions below, and the next video is already coming.